Hello, friends of the paranormal. This is your co-host, Stu, and I'm here with the paranormalist, Patty Wilson. Patty, how are you today?
I am doing well. It is above 0 degrees and the sunshine for the first time in weeks. I'm
Yeah,
happy.
yeah, as we're recording this, it is the 23rd, the last Sunday in February.
Yep.
So, which means March is not too far away. And you know what that means? Only 2 more months of winter in Pennsylvania.
Isn't that the truth? Yay!
Yeah. But with that being said, we would like to thank those of you who are joining us. We thank you. Click the subscribe if you would please. Click the like button and the bell to be notified when we release new content, which we try to do every week, but it doesn't always happen that way. Just we're sorry. We do what we can. For those of you who are returning, we thank you very, very much. And as of the last episode that we published, which was this couple days ago on Friday, we have as many subscribers as we have episodes, which is very nice. We want to thank all of you for that. In the description, you'll find everything else Paranormalist Podcast related. And with that, I will say, what's our topic for today?
Ah, well, today we're going to visit some interesting and unusual stories from the military world.
Oh,
And so, yeah, it's going to be fun. I started
mhm.
doing a little research on this morning. Started two other podcasts, and I don't know, they just didn't feel like they were the right one. And I started this one, and everything just fell into place. So if people think I slave over them for days and days on end, it's not true. They just sort of fall into my lap the right way. And this one I really like this one.
Well,
So,
knowing you, there's going to be quite a few from Gettysburg or from the Civil War.
well, we're going to start with the Revolutionary War, and I didn't
Oh,
even
okay,
touch
even
much on the
further. All right.
Civil War.
Mm-hmm.
But this is just the weirdest story. So I know a long time ago I did tell the story about George Washington at Valley Forge and the visitation by the angel and all of that. We talked about that before. People can look it up in a past podcast. But I never heard this story before. So, um, just a little background for those who don't know. At the beginning of the American Revolution, we colonials were not doing really hot. George Washington was not scoring many hits. And so he ends up being bivouacked in Valley Forge. And it's to say it was a fort would be gracious. It was really shanties and shacks and a couple buildings. And it was a bitter, bitter cold winter, tons of snow. The men had very little clothing. There were people said you could trace the soldiers by the bloody footsteps in the snow. People were eating literally the leather from their shoes because they were so starved. And it was just a really bad year, and they were badly beaten, and it was horrible winter. And of course, that's where the story of the angelic visitation of Washington comes in. But this is interesting. So, according to this article, and I've looked it up, there are letters from him that talks about this. Washington dictated to one of his officers how he would sometimes consort, that was his word, with what he called the greenskins. And listen, he described them as short warriors with green skin that came to him from the trees some evenings to speak to him. And Washington stated that these green-skinned warriors lived in the wilderness, that there was within a glowing orb that could move from place to place and hover above the earth.
Never
These
heard that
myster
before.
I never
Wow.
did either.
Wow.
These mysterious strangers um, would give Washington tactical information on the enemy, advise him on approaching battles, and he credited them with being very insightful and instrumental in some of his later victories. So the question, of course, becomes one of, well, what were the little greenskins? The thought when these letters were discovered, and there are reams and reams. Washington was definitely a letter writer. There are thousands of letters, and you can look them up there. in the National Archive. They're in historical societies. You can get them through. There's something called the Web Project. You can get a lot of his letters there. I've read multitudes of his letters over the years because I was doing research on a historical project or a book or something. And so I know there are just tons and tons of these letters out there. And they thought at first that these were maybe Native Americans who were wearing green war paint, and that their home was an animal skin tent that was round, looked round in the distance, and maybe it glowed from the firelight within. But years later, of course, people have read these letters and they have a different perspective. So they're thinking ETs.
I was
And
thinking a little something a little closer to home, but
okay,
that's
what were you thinking?
oh, just some hitherto unknown species,
Right.
or
I thought,
again, interdimensional, or I'm
yeah, I thought about the tree people, and whenever they said they came down out of the trees.
yeah, but when you've told the stories of the tree people
Mhm.
before, they were all but amenable.
Yes. But I mean, it was just interesting. And there's a historian, a Scottish historian by the name of Quentin Bird. He said he's done a lot of research on Washington in this particular story, and he talked about Washington writing in what was called the Day Book. So this would have been a book that kind of like a journal, but a journal of the military end of things, and not a private journal, that his military secretary every day would transcribe whatever he dictated, Washington dictated to him, and that in this particular military journal, this day book, he talks about interactions with greenskins and their glowing orb. He often mentioned that the orb was being seen in different places, or it would disappear altogether. And he's the one who started bringing up the idea that perhaps this was a UFO or something like that. And he said, this orb actually really does sound very much like an alien spaceship, the greenskins as the occupants, perhaps giving Washington strategic advice, or technical help to help him win this fight. There are certain records that indicated by Washington that do mention the greenskins, but what are they? Nobody has ever been able to tell. Were they Native Americans, hallucinations, aliens? Nobody knows.
Hmm. I also got the thought about you did the episode on the green skinned children, so I wonder if there's
Yes,
any relation there.
it's true.
Different
That is
continent,
true.
but
That's interesting. I hadn't thought about that, but you're right. We
Hmm.
did do that story from France about the green-skinned kids. But I just thought that was a really fascinating story because, it was one that I had never heard before.
No, new one on me as well.
And then I found another little piece of obscure history. This is not necessarily a ghost story, but it is so weird that I just had to add it. So for those who don't know, Washington supposedly caught a chill riding in the cold wintry rain and went down sick. And in 1799, he had a sore throat, a fever. Back then, this was a big deal because there weren't antibiotics and things like that. And everybody talked about how he had been out riding in this freezing rain the day before. And they called in doctors, and at the time, it was believed that by letting out a large amounts of blood, you could get the disease to leave the system, and your body would produce healthy, clean blood. To some extent, there is a little bit of truth to that. Like they do bloodletting for certain things now, and a couple other things that like leeches. They used to talk about putting leeches on a person, but now we know that they do use them today for like burn victims and stuff. And they eat the necrotic skin.
Yeah, even maggots. It's like, yeah, makes
Yes.
my skin crawl. But yeah. Hmm.
Anyway, so they came in and they did the bloodletting, but they let too much blood out is the theory. And it didn't work, and he died shortly thereafter. There is, however, just because I have to add this, another theory that he was murdered. But he died of a very he died in very much the same way as several other presidents would later die, under the same set of weird circumstances. But anyway, so the official story is that he caught the chill, got the fever and sore throat, and that because they left too much blood out of him, he was too weak to recover, and he passed away. But Washington had a phobia about being buried alive, a very realistic phobia for that time frame. There were literally, there were legions of these stories all over the world. So he made his wife promise that he would not be buried for 3 days after he died, so that if he were to return or wasn't actually dead, he wouldn't be in the ground, because they didn't embalm back then. So in that time frame, you bury the person within 24 hours because the body starts to decompose and does all kinds of nasty things. So they put him in the ice house on ice, literally, and waited out the 3 days. Now, this is where everything gets wonky. I mean, up to now, everything's pretty much cool. So after his death, a friend of his who was a physician and architect, his name was William Thornton, comes into the picture. He hears his buddy, George is dead. He goes riding out to the plantation, and he says, I have this theory that you can bring a person back to life if you catch them very early after death. And he tells Martha this outlandish tale about how his first step would be to warm the body up and rub it with blankets to stimulate circulation. Then he would inject the blood of a lamb into the body in order to spark vitality, because because they thought that lamb's blood was had restorative properties. People don't know this today, but ingesting blood in order to address illnesses was very common, both human blood and animal blood, in the 16 and 1700s. So that's where this came from. There are some hellacious stories of like kings in Europe who drank blood all the time because they believed it gave them virility and what have you. Anyway, so he believed that if you got the lamb's blood into the body, this would spark vitality. And then he said, the last key to reviving the dead is you would cut him open through a tracheotomy and pump the dead man's lungs with a bellows, which would simulate breathing and would cause him to wake up. Okay.
Yeah, already.
That's what he said. But when Martha heard the story, she wasn't interested in it. She's like, nah, I don't think so. So even though he pled his case quite well for the first day and a half, she refused. However, she made note, and the others who were at the home at that period of time made note of how insistent he was that he could raise Washington from the dead. Just an interesting little story to pass along as we move forward. I just thought it was fascinating. So, and now I'm going to share some ghost stories, some unusual stories, things like that. And I have a lot of other interesting stories, and some of them are going to appear next week. So if you like this stuff, please, make sure you tune in next week. So I'm going to fast forward to Fort Devens. During World War II, Fort Devens had German and Italian POWs housed in various parts of the base. Pre-war, it had been a 3-story brick home known as the Hale Hall. Now, the stories about it being haunted came from World War II. During World War II, there's a story that a POW of Italian descent jumped or fell from the top floor window of Hale Hall, breaking his legs and freezing to death in a snowdrift outside the building because he tried to escape late at night. Nobody noticed he was missing. He couldn't get up and go. And so by morning, when they started to search for him, it was too late. Another version of the story is that there was a German POW who hung himself in one of the rooms in the upstairs part of that building. So we're going to fast forward to the 1960s. The building is now used as a training facility for the Army Security Agency. And so there's military intelligence materials, security materials, things like that. And it had MPs. They were on 24/7 duty, and one of the MPs wrote this story. He's now retired, and he said that they called the man who haunted the third floor, whoever he was, George, and he was reportedly seen by MPs quite often, most often at night, up on the third floor, or up on the first floor. And he said one night a new MP was on duty and making his rounds on the upper floor. He had not heard the stories as of yet because he had only been there for about 24 hours. And he spotted a person in a secure area and ordered the intruder to halt. The intruder continued to walk, and the MP fired his 45. Although the MP had a clear line of fire, the intruder continued to walk until he walked right through the wall. The MP left his post to get aid.
Yeah, that and some toilet paper.
Yeah, it's an interesting story, I thought.
Yeah.
It just was fascinating.
Mhm.
There's not too far from here, you had mentioned Breezewood earlier in a private conversation. So,
Mhm.
and we live in Pennsylvania, for those who don't know, and I live not too far from Breezewood, dozens of miles or so. And right outside of Breezewood is an old CCC camp. For those who don't know, a CCC camp was actually a civilian conservation corps at the end of the Great Depression. One of the things that Franklin Delano Roosevelt came up with, or his people came up with, was a plan that if you were on assistance, welfare, whatever you want to call it today, that if you had a male child who was 14 years old or older, that child would be sent to the Civilian Conservation Corps, where they would be fed, housed, clothed, taught a trade. A lot of the people who did engineering learned how to build, walls and dams, did all kinds of work, literally got their start there. And in exchange for their labor, they would get a small stipend, and the family would get the rest of the money to take care of them. And there were at least all over Pennsylvania, I know there were like literally dozens and dozens and dozens of these places, and one of them is right up there outside of Breezewood, and in part of Buchanan National Forest. And they had completed that project. We're just decommissioning these buildings, and during World War II, they needed places to put the POWs. So in Bedford, they took over a very famous hotel and housed Japanese prisoners of war there. And they brought these German prisoners of war to the CCC camp and house them in the buildings there. And there is a story that I have heard multiple times from hunters and different people over the years that they've been out hunting or hiking or something along those lines, and they hear two men talking in German. Most often there's this wall that's built through the woods, kind of like almost like a fence, but it's a solid stone wall. And supposedly when they were building that wall, the stones fell down and crushed two of these German
Oh,
prisoners
okay.
of war.
Mhm.
Okay. And that's the legend, the story of it. And now the wall's not that high these days. You can see a lot of rocks laying around it, so it's fallen apart over time. And it's probably, I don't know, waist high at the most at this point. But supposedly they died there. And I've heard many people talk about hearing somebody speaking what sounds to them like German in the woods, and it's almost always in that same spot. So those kinds of stories, they exist. They exist everywhere. In fact, like I said, that old CCC camp, it's now completely defunct. The buildings are gone. All you can see are the foundations of it. And but it's still there. You can still see the chimneys of the great cooking building and all of that. It's an interesting thing if you ever get a chance. But to, that's another story of something like that. So this is a gentleman who was a member of the C5 based in Dover Air Force Base. And he said that the crew chief that had died a crew chief had died on a plane, in an accident about 10 years before he was assigned there. Now, he said there were always things that happened on the plane. This plane in particular was prone to things breaking down for no known reason. And he's like, so, you know, it was constantly being checked out because like you could replace something and then it would be gone or broken or something like a week later. And they didn't understand. And this went on for about the whole 10 years. And he said, anyway, he said, I was outside chatting with one of the guards when I was there one night, and I heard over his guard radio that a new tire was on the way for the C5. And he said, we're the only C5 in that area. And he said, our flight engineers and mechanics should have been the ones to order this tire. But when he went in and said, hey, the tire's coming, I just heard on the radio, and they're like, we didn't order a tire. What are you talking about? And he said, when it came, he said they were all really shocked, and they didn't realize the tire had gone bad and hadn't like checked it.
Okay.
So they didn't even know. And he said 5 minutes later, the new tire arrived, and we quickly found that we did have a flat tire, or a tire that was going flat. And he said we had no idea who requested it or why I heard the call on a security channel, because it should have only been broadcast on the maintenance channel. And he said, so to this day, we're not sure who did this, but he wondered if it was the crew chief who had died on the plane.
Interesting. Yeah. C5s, I don't know if you've ever seen one in person. They are huge.
I've
They're
never,
absolutely huge. Yeah. Yeah. Having been in the Air Force, I saw a number
Right.
of C5s actually. Yeah. You can fit other planes in a C5. They are big.
Wow.
Mhm.
Now, this story isn't exactly a military story, but it has, I think it'll fit. So I know a lot of reenactors, French and Indian, Revolutionary period and Civil War. I even know some reenactors who reenact World War II and Vietnam. I have met a lot of people from the reenactor community, some of whom do multiple characters in multiple time frames, interestingly. And so anyhow, this actually takes place not too far away. So Fort Frederick State Park in Maryland, it was an area that was filled with a lot of French and Indian activity. So during the French and Indian War, there were skirmishes there all the time. The whole region, like Bedford, which is the county that I lived in for many years, was actually part of Maryland at that time frame. And there was just a ton of this stuff. And Bedford and Fort Frederick were companions, if you will. Like they commerced back and forth. So if you were running a trading post in Bedford, you might have to go to Cumberland to get your supplies, and particularly at the beginning. So this area has a ton of French and Indian history. And this is a group of men who decided that they got permission to do a reenactment, and it was really one it was kind of for fun. They wanted to try out some of the tactical movements from the fields, the woods, that kind of stuff that would have been around the original stone fort. There is a stone fort there at Fort Frederick. That's why it's called Fort Frederick. And anyway, so during that, they're going to spend the whole night. So they're all done up in their costumes. They're doing their thing. They're all camped out in their little areas, and somewhere in the middle of the night, they start to realize there's people moving around in the woods. It's not their people. And as they're sitting up and they're watching in the darkness, you can see them kind of going past the firelight in the distance, and you can see they have colonial uniforms, and they're carrying flintlocks. And as they run across the open field to get back into the tree lines, they're seeing them really well. And they're headed towards the Potomac River. So nobody could figure out who these people were. And in the morning, they decided to go out and look for footprints and stuff like that. There was nothing out there. Nobody showed up. They spoke to Fort Frederick Park to find out if anybody else had permits to be out there, that maybe they just accidentally stumbled on another group or something like that. And, nothing like that happened. To this day, they're completely puzzled. Now, that brings me to a Gettysburg story. I will tell one Gettysburg story here. Very similar. So, in order to do it, particularly in the past, it's a little less difficult now. But the guy who ran Gettysburg National Battlefield, he was very, very strict about everything. And so in order to do like a reenactment, you had to fill in all these forms, you had to go through all this red tape. There was a lot of stuff that had to happen. Park rangers monitored everything very, very strictly. One of the things that obviously you could not do is have an actually loaded gun. So they had to be replicas, they had to be inoperable, or you had to show them that the mechanism could be disengaged and that there was no real powder, no real shot, nothing was there. No cartridges or anything like that. You could have pretend ones that made it look good for the tourists, but that was about as far as it could go. And if you got caught with any live weapons, then you were banned forever. And you can see why, because you don't want anybody to get killed by accident.
Sure. Yeah.
So anyhow, this was during I believe it was a 4th of July event, the Battle of Gettysburg taking place at that time frame. And they were doing a huge reenactment, multiple units coming in, both Northern and Southern, to do this massive reenactment of one of the battles of the Battle of Gettysburg. It's a 4-day event, the Battle of Gettysburg itself, with multiple fronts in multiple areas over multiple miles. So there's a lot of different things happening. And they've picked an area that's part of the national park to showcase the battle. And so they're doing the battle, they're fighting, and this is out near the Little Round Top area.
Okay.
And they have a lot of smoke because they want it to look authentic. You can smell the gunpowder smell, and the guys get all grimy and dirty and sweaty. You can imagine running around in a wool uniform in July. You don't smell so good, and you're rolling around in the ground trying to crawl across the open spaces and the whole 9 yards. So there was this gentleman who a friend of mine was familiar with, who would later tell the stories. This comes from Mark Nesbitt. And this gentleman, as daylight's waning, he decides to take this little hill. And he gets up this little hill and he's sitting there and he's thinking, this is a good place. There's a little bit of a breeze. I'm just going to stay here for a little while and then get back to my unit. They'll get supper, the whole 9 yards. And then the next morning, the battle will pick up and you can go back to where you were. So he's sitting up there watching as the battle's kind of beginning to wane on the flatlands. And he hears a man and he turns around because the man says, that was a really tough fight today. And the guy turns and he looks and he sees another guy in a reenactor. And this guy's really shabbily dressed and doesn't have a nice new uniform or any of that stuff. And he's got dirt and sweat streaked across his face and what have you. And he says, yeah, it was. And the guy says, you got any cartridges? And he's like, I got 3. And he kind of shows him the 3 that are kind of there on his belt. And he goes, here, son. And he hands him a couple cartridges. And he says, that ain't going to make it through tomorrow. You're going to need more. And he gives him this couple cartridges. And the guy looks at the cartridges, and to his shock, they're loaded. They're real. And they are authentic. Like, these are vintage Civil War cartridges. And he looks up at the guy to say to him, you can't have live ammo on the battlefield. I don't know where you got this. And the guy is just gone.
Mm-hmm.
He's just not there. And there's nowhere he could have gone to sitting on that little hill that you could disappear that quickly. You'd have to have crossed flatland to get somewhere else, and you would have been seen. And so he tucks them into his jacket so nobody sees them. And then he gets back to his guys at the end of the night and the evening, and he shows them and he hands them into to the park ranger, and he says, look, this is what I have, and I'm going to leave them over here. There's somebody on the battlefield that gave them to me. And he tells this crazy story. And eventually he after the battle and all of this over the course of time, he gets really curious. So he has a expert on military cartridges and guns that was their area of expertise was the Civil War period. Look at them. They are authentic cartridges made during the Civil War. The paper, the gunpowder, everything about them indicates that. These weren't modern cartridges made to look old. And he said, I can only say that I've come to believe throughout the years that we were not the only ones fighting the battle out there that night.
That makes me think of all kinds of questions. Number one is, all right, so if the soldier who was misplaced in time gave up some of his live ammo, okay, that means that he gave up live ammo that he would have been able to use at that time. And how did that change the outcome by not having those cartridges?
Oh, that's a good question.
Yeah.
That's an interesting question. Did it change the outcome?
Well, yeah,
That's a
yeah. Think about that. It's or was it if that person would have appeared to many other people? I mean, or did they? Does the ethos just manufacture cartridges to hand out? During time. It's an interesting, time slip kind of thing.
right.
In my mind, those things are really, really fascinating. So the fact that they were able to be examined and they didn't cease to exist, you know,
Yeah. That
yeah,
was
were they?
interesting. The whole thing's
Mhm,
interesting. I just
mhm,
think it's
yeah.
just a fantastic story. Um, so, and I have to tell you, when you want to talk about stuff like that, during the shooting for the movie Gettysburg,
Hmm.
there were insane stories coming out. Like there were local people who would use their vans or their pickup trucks and they would pick up the reenactors because, there were a
Hmm.
lot of reenactors there, most of whom were just extras, but they needed a bunch of bodies surging across the battlefield, so they had a lot of them. And they would pick these people up every evening for, the film companies would pay them, and they would take them back into town, and they were renting hotel rooms, that kind of stuff. And on multiple occasions, there were crazy stories. Like there's this one from this woman who was doing exactly that. She'd take her pickup truck out every evening and haul these people in, and she watched them all get off the back of the pickup, and as she's starting to she pulls out of the hotel parking lot area, and she's looking in the rearview mirror, and she realizes there's still a man sitting in the back done up in the clothes, and she thinks, holy shit, did he fall asleep or what, because she was headed home. So she pulls over and she gets out and he's not there. And, you heard those kinds of stories all the time, stories of, there's a story about a group of soldiers that were going through the battlefield and they walked into mist like early in the morning, and it looks really cinematically interesting. So they told him to walk into the mist, but they talked later about it, and they said that when they were in the mist, it was cold and ethereal, and you could see other people like moving with them and among them, and they weren't part of the unit that was supposed to be there, and they could hear screams and things like that weren't part of the script. And
I actually got to be there for part of the filming of that. In fact, at that time, it didn't have the name of Gettysburg. Well, it's from the book, The Killer Angels. And so my father, who worked for a cable company at the time, would go to these shows, and he had passes that we were able to go. And I remember holding my son. My son was, still an infant. We're holding him, and they had the hats that said the Killer Angels, and they had that, the both
right.
flags on them and everything. And because my son's name is Zach, and we met a horse named Zach, which was kind of interesting. That's one of the reasons I remember that. But yeah, just seeing the reenactors out on the battlefield, or the actors, was just fascinating to see. I didn't see
Yeah,
anything paranormal. At least I don't think I did. I wouldn't have known. Standing back in the um,
right.
where the people who even had because we always had these little badges and everything to let us stand there and watch. But yeah, that was interesting, even just to see that part of it.
Yeah, I mean, it was
Mm.
fascinating, the stories that were coming out of there, the whole thing. That's like Cashtown, there's a story that whenever they were there, Ted Turner and the author, they went to Cashtown, and when they saw that hill that Cashtown sits on, like you come down around a curve, and there's this, it drops down, and Cashtown sits on that hill, that they knew that they wanted that to be part of the movie, so they ended up bringing Martin Sheen. Had already gone back to Hollywood. They brought him back, and they spent $1 million or some crazy number like that to like cover the parking lots and the highway with dirt. They removed all the electrical lines and kind of changed their did everything they had to have him to ride down that hill, because he played Lee, and that was important to the movie. They wanted to show it because Cashtown was the major staging area for the South after as the battle progressed. They say more Confederate soldiers walked through the door of Cashtown than any place else except in Virginia, and their national capital. And anybody who wants to go to a haunted place, I guarantee that place is haunted.
Okay.
I've ghost hunted that place so many times, man. So, but anyway, so those are some of the stories. We're going to move forward here to Afghanistan. So there's a place in Afghanistan. It's called, I apologize if I butcher it. I'm not doing it on purpose. Baghlan, and it's known as the Tapa, and it's basically meaning Russian hill. So it's Tapa Gurhan, but it means Russian hill, and it's because, for those who don't know, Russia tried to take Afghanistan, and they tried for 15, 20 years. It was a long siege, and they couldn't. In the end, they just backed out of it and said, fine, you can have it. We don't want it that bad. So the area is called the Tapa. And there's only one hill in the entire valley. And it's not really a hill. It's a burial mound that has existed since the time of Alexander the Great. Generations and generations of locals are also buried there, and dead Russians from the 1980s were buried in this.
Yeah, that was under Brezhnev, wasn't it?
I believe, yeah.
Okay. Yeah.
So when the Americans come there, the special ops dudes have to figure out where to park themselves in this valley. They pick the only high spot, which is this huge burial mound that looks like a hill. And they level the top of it out so that they can put a compound up there, an outpost. And this is where this gentleman's story begins. This gentleman was one of the soldiers who was there. And he was stationed at Tapa on that hill. And he says he was a regular Army paratrooper attached to a special ops unit, and they were building this outpost. And one of the rules for the Army guys was to watch the radios at night. So they would, that was your only communication, to get back to, your commanders and what have you. So this was a vital job. And he said that once we got there, that they would hear this weird babble at night, and some of them said it was interference. And he said, but I was a radio ops guy for years, and I never believed that, because if you listened in the middle of the night, you would hear voices. First they'd be soft and it would just be garbled, but over the course of time, he noticed that sometimes it would get louder and clearer, and when it did, it sounded like Russian being spoken. So it's like 2:30, 3 o'clock in the morning. He's on his shift. His shift's just about to end, and he's like, I walked down, when I got relieved, I walked down to this little, it was just a brick house, literally. It was a little brick building made out of cinder block, and it was where the privy was. So he had to go to the bathroom, and he's in there, and he hears footsteps walking past it up the hill. And that makes no sense. Everybody is asleep except for the guy who relieved him, and he better be on top of Tapa because that's where he's supposed to be monitoring that radio. So he's thinking, he says, like, honestly, I just didn't want to die getting killed in the crapper. So he's like, I kind of opened the door a little bit to peek out, and I thought, maybe it's one of the locals or, one of the bad guys, and I have to better find this out before they find me. So he's watching, and he said, that's when I realized it couldn't have been a local person. In fact, so there's something called Meta-Ik boots, and these boots were worn by the Russians, and they have a distinctive sound to them. They have a jingle when you walk because the boots have buckles that jingle when you walk. America does not wear those boots. He had never seen any of those boots from the locals. He had only seen them in photographs and videos taken in Afghanistan during the 1980s when the Russians were there. So he recognizes this sound, and he said, he didn't, he's like, I wonder if somebody kept a pair of those boots. And then he hears like the clatter of the combat gear and stuff. And he's completely convinced that somebody is decked out in 1980s gear walking up past him. So he looks out, and there's nothing. It says there was a full moon. It was decent ambient light. I could definitely see. At this point, he didn't see anything. And then he catches a person getting close to the top of the hill, headed, but not from the outpost, but towards the outpost. And that shouldn't be. That dude better be up there at the radio and monitoring things and doing his job. And he's like, so I grab my rifle and go out the door, and I start to run up the hill after this person. And I get to the top, and nobody's there, just nobody. So he goes into the radio shack, and the radio guy is there, and he's like, what's up? Why didn't you go back to bed? Why don't you go to bed? And he's like, did somebody come into the barracks? He said, we hunted, I didn't go to sleep. I stayed up. I knew I saw somebody. So next day, they're all at lunch, and he tells a couple of his buddies. The other guy tells a couple of buddies, and they're all joshing about the Russian ghost. Ha ha ha! You've been out here too long. You're seeing dead people walk and crap like this, and they're just kind of giving them stuff. And he said then over the course of time, I wasn't the only one. That we would start to see a figure who would appear from the dirt when we were standing on the top trying to fill the sandbags. And he said eventually somebody found bones while they were digging the sand up to do the sandbags, because obviously it was a burial mound. So
Sure,
at some
yeah.
level you're going to hit bones. And he said all the other guys started to chime in over time, and they were talking about their stories. And he said, all I can tell you is we all saw him from time to time. We saw him. And he would be standing going up the hill, standing at the top, watching us, things like that. And he said, I just feel like I know it is a lone Russian soldier who was caught in a perpetual loop of combat, walking forever up to an outpost on the Afghan desert where his men were stationed before us. And he said, it has similar characteristics to other stories he's heard from Afghanistan, that when you go to Afghanistan, you hear a lot of stories of the Russian soldiers that still haunt the place. So I thought that was a really cool story. I am going to, for the sake of time, I'm going to skip this story and come back to it next week, this next one, because it's a little long and I wanted to get to a couple other stories. So I want to kind of end with this story for tonight. And then, as I said, I have enough to do at least another episode. So there's a really fascinating story. This is told by a gentleman who actually witnessed it. He was one of the men in this unit. So it was years ago in the heat of war. There was a soldier who got a call, and there was an ambush in a nearby airfield. And he said they needed everybody to go out there stat. So he said we jumped into the closest vehicles and headed out to the airfield with some of the other guys. When we get there, one of the guys starts to freak out. He said he keeps screaming. He sees a man. He sees a man crawling over the fence from the outside, coming towards the airfield, trying to get into the airfield. And he said we all looked in that direction and we saw it. And we lifted up our weapons and fired a single shot each directly into this man. One bullet made contact for sure, and the man who was kind of hunkered down running stands up for a second, drops over dead, or they think he falls. And he said, we're standing there kind of like waiting to see if he's going to get up again, what's going to happen, you know, and all of a sudden there's this black smoke that begins to pour out of him. And he says one of the guys makes a comment that it looks like a suicide bomber and that we must have hit his vest, and that's the smoke from some detonated, you know, armament that's coming out. He said, but as we watch him and we're standing back watching him, more and more smoke continues to come out until a black fog surrounded the man and made a human-like creature. The fog itself, that black fog, created a human-like creature.
Oh.
Through the darkness of that being, we could see red glowing eyes glaring back at us. And then this being made of smoke laughed at us. We raised our weapons in fear, but the man said that this creature took a step forward and then a couple more steps, and then it just dissipated. And he said, I was never able to make any sense out of this. I don't know what happened. None of us have ever been able to make any sense out of this. And then this is where we're going to cliffhanger it. He said, I thought it was just us until I began to look into it. There are multiple accounts of red-eyed creatures, and I will share one of those in the opening for next week's stories. But I'm fascinated with all of these stories. They're insane stories. And like I said, we could do this for like 3-4 weeks. If we wanted, I'm going to do 2 of them, and then we'll maybe come back and visit and do 2 more later on in the year. But just amazing stories. And this one actually reminded me of some other things I have heard, military stories of creatures that were on the battlefields. And wait till you hear about one of the creatures from next week.
Gonna make us wait. Okay.
I am.
Mm-hmm.
So. But yeah, I thought that was a fascinating story. So with that, I'm going to say good night to everybody. I hope you've enjoyed the stories this evening. And to my son, Michael, who was begging me for military ghost stories, I hope you enjoyed.